And on this segment, I explain all of it, at least about some particular item in Tucson or Southern Arizona history. And then you know all of it, and I know all of it, and we have a little shared experience that we have. And today, as you probably can guess from the fact that I'm doing this segment, I'm a big history geek, especially Southwestern history. And in certain biographies and describing certain events, I'm going to fanboy out pretty hard. And today probably is the time I'm going to fanboy out hardest of all, so I'm just getting it out of the way. Because I'm going to talk about Lozen. Lozen was a Chiricahua Apache woman. And the Chiricahua Apaches were the band that Cochise and Geronimo belonged to, and they were the most prominent band in the Apache Wars. Probably if you're picturing the Apache Wars, you're picturing a Chiricahua. And another prominent Chiricahua, not as well known as Cochise or Geronimo, was a gentleman named Victorio. He was a chief, and Lozen was his sister. And in addition to being that, Lozen was a very prominent warrior, kind of a right hand to Victorio. Victorio actually referred to her as his right hand. She was a counselor, she was a strategist, and was also a very powerful medicine woman. It was said that she had a power where if she prayed to the supreme deity of the Apaches, who was called Lozen, she would be able to find the location of their enemy when they were in battle, which with the kind of warfare that Apaches did and the warfare that was in the desert at this time, it would be really important. She would pray, and accounts say that she would get a sensation in her palms, and that somehow translated to the location of these enemies, which is pretty cool. Anyway, Lozen was unique also because she never married. Now, for Apache women, it wasn't as weird if they were warriors or combatants, but it was usually accompanying their husbands, but Lozen didn't have a husband. And part of the reason for that was that Chief Victorio kind of stuck up for her and said that she was too important in her role, so she didn't have to get married. He also said, quite famously, that Lozen was a shield to her people. That was sort of how she was known. And she had a very colorful career as a warrior, but the most prominent episode, I guess, would be in this series of engagements in the Apache Wars that's referred to as Victorio's War, because Victorio was the leading antagonist to the United States and Mexico during this period. Basically, what precipitated that was that Victorio's band had come in willingly to a reservation that was called the San Carlos Reservation, or otherwise known throughout the Arizona Territory as Hell's 40 Acres. It's a really bad place. A lot of Apaches died there of disease and just was really terrible conditions. And so not surprisingly, Victorio led a breakout, or they jumped the reservation, as they said at that time, and thus began another phase of the Apache Wars. And Lozen participated very closely with Victorio during this time. But the coolest episode, probably apocryphal, or maybe all of it, at least definitely some of it's apocryphal because it's crazy. But anyway, this story goes around that while they were fleeing Americans and going into Mexico, and I guess also fleeing the Mexicans at the same time, there was this Apache woman that was going to give birth, and Lozen stayed behind with her. Now, either, it's not quite sure which one it was, either they were purposefully wanting to take her back to the reservation because it was too dangerous out there, which shows you how dangerous it was out there because they wanted to take her back to Hell's 40 Acres with the baby, or she was starting to have the baby and Lozen was assigned to protect her, and then the Americans kind of cut them off from the rest of the people, and so they had to go back to the reservation. But anyway, the story was that Lozen has to take this new mother and this newborn baby back to the reservation through 2 countries, 3 states, Sonora, New Mexico, and Arizona, I guess 4, including Chihuahua. And they were trying to get her back through these 2 hostile armies, which you manga fans will basically recognize as kind of the plot of Lone Wolf and Cub. And it was equally awesome. There are all these crazy stories going around of Lozen protecting this baby. Like, there was this, they got hungry, obviously, and Lozen came across this longhorn steer, but she was not afraid, because Lozen was never afraid. She was concerned that shooting it would alert people around, so she just killed it with a knife. She just went in and, like, stabbed this longhorn steer with a knife, which, those are giant, angry animals. That's amazing. And then, I guess they got thirsty after eating the steer meat, so Lozen also killed this calf and cut out its stomach and made a little canteen out of its stomach. And you wonder why they didn't eat the calf, which is why some of this kind of might be some tall tales. But anyway, it's cool. Then, of course, they didn't have a horse, and Lozen, in addition to everything else, was an expert horse thief. So she came across this camp, and some people say it was just some Mexican cowboys, some vaqueros. Some people say it was Mexican soldiers. Some people say it was American soldiers. But anyway, basically, they all say that she just blitzed in there and stole a horse, like not even caring, just went in there. And like there were people shooting at her and stuff. She like matrixed her way out with the horse. It was awesome. And then also maybe in that episode, not sure if it was a different episode or not, Lozen also apparently stole a soldier's uniform, which is maybe my favorite because I don't know exactly what she would use it for. Like, it's not a good disguise for her. She's an Apache woman and they would recognize her. I just picture her wearing it for fun because she's awesome. But anyway, Lozen and the baby and the mom all got back to the reservation eventually, which is where they learned that Victorio had been killed, and he had been killed in a skirmish in Mexico by Mexican soldiers. And so Lozen jets out of there, and again, all alone, crosses these 4 states and 2 countries while being pursued by these patrols, and hooks up with the remainder of Victorio's band, which is now led by a guy named Nana, who was incidentally an 80-year-old man, also an awesome guy. I might talk about him at another point. But in retaliation for the killing of Victorio, basically, he leads this raid into New Mexico that's called Nana's Raid. And pound for pound, it's probably the bloodiest part of the Apache Wars. Maybe, it's pretty close anyway, because in a very short amount of time, they just killed like 45 guys, which was crazy. Anyway, when that's all over, eventually Lozen does get hooked up with Geronimo, and she is there till the bitter end, as was Geronimo. Geronimo was the last Native American leader, not just in the Apaches or in Arizona, but in the whole country to really surrender in force, and his surrender really marks the end of the Indian Wars in the United States. But what happened to him is he was on the reservation, and then he also broke out. People say that that was because he was concerned about a rumor going around that was maybe not totally unsubstantiated, that they were going to ship him and some other incorrigibles to Alcatraz, and there's also an apocryphal story going around, maybe true, that Lozen was there at the time and that she just so happened to be on the reservation because she was trying to steal ammunition, and maybe kind of gave him the idea, like, yeah, bust out, and so they did. What definitely was true was that Lozen was there. She was kind of a go-between between the army and the last Apaches hiding out in the mountains in Mexico. That was also a traditional role of women as envoys, as ambassadors, and Lozen was the best, so they had her do it. Eventually that came to an end, I think, as everyone, even the Apaches, knew it would at some point. What precipitated it was that the army threatened to ship their family to Florida, which is even worse then than it would be now. But they couldn't stand that, so they all came in, and as you might expect, they all got shipped to Florida anyway, including them. And that's where the only known photograph of Lozen comes from, because Lozen, they all get on a train and they stop in Texas on their way to Florida, and they all get out and they all take this picture. And it's interesting, you learn a lot about Lozen just from this one photograph, because Geronimo is there front and center, he's the leader, and Lozen is right behind him, which analysts have said that indicates like the second position, that's the second in command. But she's also with all the women and children, which it really goes to who she was. She was a woman warrior. She was not a woman posing as a man and therefore taking on these manly roles of warrior. She was a fully realized warrior and a fully realized woman, and she was both of those things. What's cool about Lozen is that Lozen was really, at least it comes across to me, someone who knew who she was and just lived it. And by the sheer force of her abilities and her power, everyone else dealt with it, which was great. What's not so great, unfortunately, is her demise, her eventual death. She does go out to Florida, and then they eventually do move the Apaches to the Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, another army installation, and the climate there is much different from the climate that's here, and as a result of that, Lozen gets tuberculosis, and she dies there. And that's where she's buried now, which is really kind of a sad ending to an otherwise really awesome life. Someone who I really picture in this Arizona and Southwestern history as kind of an epic hero on the scale of like a Hercules or something in Greek mythology. So thanks, Lozen, for being awesome. And thank you for watching. I'll see you next time on Andrew Explains It All.